Exposure, of course, is made up of the shutter speed, the aperture, but also the ISO, and this is often called the exposure triangle. 100 ISO means the sensor is at its lowest sensitivity to light. Higher ISO settings gradually increase the sensitivity of the sensor through 200, 400, 800, 1600 and sometimes even beyond that. But I'm sure you already know this. There's a familiar exposure pattern here, but I suspect that you know that too. That each of the steps you can see here between these ISO settings are equivalent to one stop on our camera. You don't have to own a digital camera very long before you realize that the higher the ISO setting, the more noise you see in the image. So the obvious decision to come to is keep ISO as low as it's practically possible to do. The one vital thing to remember when we consider ISO is this. If you really need a faster shutter speed and the only way to achieve that is by pushing up the ISO, then do it. For the simple reason that we can do something about noise in an image, but we can do precious little about an unsharp or a blurred image. So two questions we may ask is, how do we know when we need to increase shutter speed, and how do we keep noise to its minimum? Here's a simple guide that I've remembered for well over 30 years, and it's still valid even in the digital age. Always try to keep your shutter speed, I'm talking here when the camera is being handheld, always keep your shutter speed at least as high as the focal length of the lens you're using. So if you're using a 200mm zoom lens, then you really should be aiming for 0.02 of a second shutter speed. Even if you couldn't quite achieve 0.02 of a second with a 200mm lens, remembering that rule at least alerts you to the possibility of camera shake, and you can take other precautions. Minimizing noise is simple. If you have to raise ISO, never underexpose the image, and wherever you can, expose to the right. This allows us to manipulate the image from light tones to darker ones, not the other way round, which makes noise worse. In addition, take a look at the luminance in the noise reduction section of Camera Raw to smooth out any noise that remains. Now let's take a look at the image I've had on screen for a minute or two. I was using a 400mm lens here, but I did have the camera on a tripod. But that wasn't so much to reduce the movement of me and the lens, it was really to combat the problem here that we're photographing fast moving birds. The aperture that I've used here at 5.6 is the maximum aperture of the lens I was using, so I cannot squeeze any more light onto the sensor using the aperture. And to achieve 125th of a second, I had to set the ISO to 800. If we look over to the right hand side at the exposure indicator, it's telling us that the exposure given was the one the camera wanted to give, yet this image is exposed to the right. You can see that clearly in the background being much lighter than you would expect if we were shooting in a rainforest, and of course the bird is quite light too. If we think through what's happened here, it's quite interesting. I'm pointing my lens into a very dark rainforest situation, although the exposure given here doesn't look like that because it's exposed to the right. The image is being seen brighter than it actually was. If we just stop for a moment and consider the 125th of a second at f5.6 with 800 ISO, I think that probably gives us a better idea of the dark conditions we were shooting in. But the image is exposed to the right, yet there's no exposure compensation being shown. Well, the truth is the camera got this exposure wrong, because in a dark forest we would normally expect to drop the exposure by about 1 stop. Remember the logic here, the camera doesn't know what we're photographing, we're looking into a very dark scene, the camera sees the darkness and it wants to overexpose. But here the camera's made a mistake, but that just happens to be in my favour for the conditions I was in. In fact, I have my 1 stop increase, although it doesn't show on the right hand side. We can clearly see that when we look at the image. Now, as you can see by the spinning round of the screen, I brought you into camera raw here to try to demonstrate the difference between the image we're viewing here with 1 stop less exposure. If you look at the exposure scale on the right hand side, I'm just going to drop that down to -1 stop. So in a rainforest situation we would expect this to be closer to the exposure most people would aim for. But of course here we're looking to expose to the right because we're using high ISO. So the camera made a mistake and give us this exposure, but it actually works in our favour. Enlarging the image to 100% does allow us to see just a little bit of noise, which we can see a little more easily in areas like this which don't have detail, but we can hardly see them in the feathers and we can hardly see them in the twig, and as yet we've done no work on this image whatsoever, so we do have the opportunity to smooth out that noise. So to prevent noise when we're using high ISO, as best you can expose to the right, so your manipulation is always going in the right direction. So coming back to the original image here, we need to move on and take a look at the result. And as we look at the completed image, you can see very little evidence of noise, because the exposure has allowed me to edit from light to dark, so I'm not making the noise any worse, and I've also added a little noise reduction in camera raw, and then I have a shot worth showing. And by the way, this is a wattle bird. If your camera has an automatic ISO setting, I would suggest you make sure it's turned off, because we're going to be looking at an image next where the photographer had forgotten the auto ISO was set. They'd taken their eye off of the exposure ball. Now just cast your eyes around the settings that we used here, because this exposure is just not logical. But it is what I see each month in my own camera club competitions, where sometimes even experienced photographers are using settings that are difficult to fathom or justify, and they're affecting their image quality. There was definitely no need here to use an ISO of 2500, which has introduced a lot of noise. The rocks were not going anywhere. There are plenty of railings to rest on to get a good solid shot, and the lens used was 70mm. So the author could have shot this at a 60th of a second. A 60th of a second is very close to that little guide I mentioned earlier, but because we can rest nice and solidly on a railing, then we're going to easily get away with a good sharp shot at a 60th of a second. We could have dropped the aperture down to f4 because we don't have any depth of field issues here. So we could have used 200 ISO rather than 2500, and we would have got the same result from an exposure point of view. Now this image is exposed way to the right, and of course that would help in a high ISO situation. But here the author has allowed either the camera's auto ISO settings to take away most of the image quality, or they've left the ISO set from a previous setting when it was perhaps necessary. Let's take a look at the noise in this image in Camera Raw. If we just take a brief look at the histogram at the top of the screen, we can see evidence there, even if we weren't viewing the image, that we've got a pretty bright exposure. But nothing we can't recover from. We haven't lost any detail here, so that's one good thing about this image. So I would be dropping down the exposure a little bit, just to put those peaks of the histogram in the center a little more. I would be bringing down the blacks, I would be raising the whites, tweaking here and there, a little bit of mid-tone clarity, a bit of vibrance, and straight away we're starting to get closer to what we were looking for originally. But now let's take a look at the noise here. I can bring this up to 100% instantly just by double clicking the zoom here, and you can see that straight away. But if I drag down so we see a little bit of the rock edges and the background, you can see this picture is extremely noisy. Now we can do something about this using the luminosity slider in the detail section. But why would we need to do that if we could have shot this at 200 ISO, and I think at a push we may have even got down to 100. So here we have a situation where we've let our guard down, we've got sidetracked a little bit, concentrating more on what we're actually focusing on, and we're not paying attention to the exposure that's about to be given by those automatic settings. Something we all do from time to time, but here it's quite damaging to the final image. Now here we have another illogical exposure in my view. If you look at the settings just below the histogram, the ISO was set at 500. Now we can see quite clearly that the conditions, although this is an evening shot and the light was becoming low, there was plenty of light about. We can see that just by viewing the image. So we didn't need a 500 ISO. We could drop that 2 stops to 100, and then we've got to find 2 stops elsewhere. Well, we've got them in the values above, because we certainly don't need F10 either, which is very close to F11, so 2 stops down from F11 would be F8 and then 5.6. 5.6 would have been enough to capture the depth of field in this image, but if it wasn't, we've still got some flexibility in the shutter. So this is another example where if we don't keep an eye on the exposure the camera's about to give, we can get quite frustrated when we get home and see the images on the computer for the first time. Although a 500 ISO may not be insurmountable to us here, why should we start off with a disadvantage? Here we have another example of an illogical exposure. Now this image was shot from a tripod, so when you look up just below the histogram and you see an ISO setting of 3200, all of that was not necessary. We could have shot this image at 100 ISO because the shutter speed wasn't really valid. We could drop that down as low as we wanted, and we've still got scope with the f-stop too. We could probably come down to f8, which would have given us 2 more stops to use in the shutter speed. But because we was on a tripod, we really didn't have any need whatsoever to use 3200 ISO. So before we've even touched the image in our image editor, we've got a hill to climb. The problem is, of course, when we're there at the time taking the pictures, we don't see the quality problems that we've got, because we're only looking at a very small thumbnail on the back of the camera. It's backlit and they all look good. It's only when we get the image opened up in Camera Raw, something like this, and then maybe look at the image at a 100% magnification, that we begin to see that we've got a real uphill struggle to create anything of quality from this particular exposure. So dealing with ISO is easy. Keep it at the lowest setting you can to maximize the quality of your images and to give you flexibility within your image editor. Certainly you don't want to allow exposure to put you at a disadvantage before you even start. But in those situations where we do really need a higher shutter speed, and the only way to achieve it is with ISO, then we must take it, because we can do something about an image that's even got bad amounts of noise within it. We can't do anything with an unsharp picture.